Shabbat Shalom, everybody. As I mentioned, this is a super Shabbat. We are reading a super Parsha. Tomorrow is the Super Bowl. And even though we have connection to one of the teams, which makes it super, Mitchell Schwartz will not be playing tomorrow. And so instead of endorsing and clearly rooting for one team as I did on the Bima last year, I will allow everybody to root for both teams since Mitch is on the injured list. I'd like to talk about the Ten Commandments this morning because I spent a great deal of time this week trying to learn about them, trying to learn something about them that I had not learned previously before. And of course, that journey for me began with the Baal Shem Tov and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And it just so happened that the first comment in the Baal Shem Tov's commentary comes from the Degel Machane Ephraim, comes from another teaching from a subsequent generation of Hasidic masters. And it's on the word Anochi. And it's the same piece of teaching from the Talmud that other Hasidic Rebbes also refer to. And it made me stop and wonder about the word Anochi. So just to explain, the teaching from the Talmud teaches that the first word of the Ten Commandments, that first line, Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. That first word Anochi, we're taught in Masechet Shabbat, page 105. Anochi is an abbreviation. Rabbi Yochanan teaches that it actually stands for Ana Nafshi Ketivat Yahavit, right? Each letter in Anochi stands for a word, and those words mean I myself write and give, meaning this, commandments, these commandments, or in a greater sense, this entire text of the Torah, right? This is God's signature that God actually is the one giving it. Another tradition of an abbreviation in the next line of the Talmud is Amira Ne'ima Kativa Yehiva. Also the first letters of the word Anochi, coming to mean a pleasant statement is written and given, meaning that these statements are good for us. They're pleasant. And the last in these three different abbreviation explanations is that we're supposed to read Anochi backwards, which I think has to be, I don't know, in the tradition of children in the 60s who used to listen to records played backwards, probably. They found that if you look at Anochi backwards, it means Yehiva Kativa Ne'emanin Amareha. It was written, it was given, and all of these statements are indeed faithful. And it made me think, why is there such a tradition that is built on understanding this first word of the Ten Commandments? Why is there such a collection of midrashic and rabbinic explanations for this first word? I had never really stopped to think that in the Torah that we read every week, Abraham hears from God, right? The founder of the Jewish people, let's just say Sarah overhears God's messages from the next tent. Isaac hears God's voice. Rebecca hears God's voice. Jacob hears God's voice. Moses hears God's voice. We, the Jewish people, have never heard God's voice. We take it from secondhand sources that God has spoken to somebody and told us to do something. This is how the message is relayed to us. We take it for granted because each and every week the Torah is opened and we hear God's voice now. But back then in that moment, this first word, Anochi, was the first time the Jewish people heard God's voice. And it must have been so impactful that it creates an entire tradition of what that first sound, what we can derive meaning, how we derive meaning out of that very first syllable, that first word. How do we use that first word to understand godliness? On so many levels, Anochi can be analyzed. Anochi begins with the letter Aleph, which carries with it no sound at all. We teach children, I know every year because I do it, we teach kids in religious school that the Torah begins with the letter Bet to assure us that there's no end and that there's no beginning to the Torah. We're always studying Torah, right? So when children begin, at whatever age they begin studying Torah, they've actually been studying Torah longer than that. They've been immersed in Torah. And we're immersed in the Torah the entire year, which is why we're never a Shabbos without the Torah. Simchas Torah comes and we end the Torah and begin the Torah in the same day so that we're never outside of the Torah. And yet God begins God's introduction of God's self with the letter Aleph, not the letter Bet, not some kind of hard consonant that gives us a sound, but with a letter that can be interpreted a million different directions, with a letter that actually should be silent, and yet God gives it life. God begins with the word Anochi and the letter Aleph. From a place that is so distant, God begins with a greeting that seems so familiar. All of us do this. When we meet somebody, the first thing we do is we say, I'm Nolan. Nice to meet you. I'm Dale. I'm Mitch. I'm Mort, right? I'm just naming the people who are involved in the service so far. It's how we introduce ourselves to somebody to make them feel comfortable. We introduce ourselves by making them understand that we have a personal connection. You know who I am now. I am the Lord your God who has taken you out of Egypt only 3 months ago. I'm the same being that performed all those miracles for you, that all of the plagues, that split the sea, that broke the hold that Egypt had around your necks. One would think that God would need no introduction. If ever there was something that didn't need an introduction, God would certainly fall into that category. The earth was shaking, thunder and lightning. Shofar blast was heard permeating our entire campsite. And then through all of that, we get a nice to meet you, I'm God introduction. We get an introduction of I am Anochi. And we struggle through the generations of rabbinic understanding to try to understand still today the very first moments of Anochi. Forget about theological problems that we've had through all of our existence as Jews. We could go back, beginning with COVID, going through the Shoah, all kinds of different, why would God do this? Why would God do that? But it all begins with this very familiar Anochi, which on the surface is not so familiar at all. Which on the surface is God breathing life into a letter that actually remains without sound and without life on its usual basis. The Kabbalists take this letter and say that the letter Aleph comes to represent God self. The letter Aleph represents Ein Sof. The letter Aleph represents a beginning before the beginning. right? Something before the bet of the Torah. The letter Aleph comes to represent an idea that existed long before there was sound. It represents the emanation from a deeper place. Imagine an idea that we come up with and how that idea has to emerge through our brain, come through our system, how our mouth has to form something in terms of our lips and our tongue to make a word. And the Aleph represents the very beginning of that entire process. This is the first time that we, the Jewish people, stood at the base of Mount Sinai. And God has the ability to point us in any direction with that first introduction. That first syllable, the first letter, thought out. Which is the letter that I should introduce myself, that I should use to introduce myself to the Jewish people? And the letter is actually a signpost that points to something long before. In this statement, I'm the Lord your God that brought you out of Egypt. It is, in many ways, the hunch of the rabbis in the Talmud that it's an abbreviation, because really what it could say is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, who directed Joseph down into Egypt in the first place, who revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who took Abraham's family from somewhere else in Ur-Kasdim and brought him to the promised land of Israel. I'm the one who brought the ability to have children to Sarah. I'm the one who will be with you forever. What God is saying to the children of Israel is what we say to our children and our children's children. We continue to say that this tradition has been with us long before we were on this earth and will be with us long after. And it's your job now to take up that mantle. The signpost points somewhere long before in the Aleph. And yet, it's the simplest, most accessible letter in the Hebrew alphabet. The Aleph is a symbol of possibility. The Aleph is an invitation that each of us now can give sound, can give voice to the idea that God proposes in those initial moments. The letter Aleph is a signpost that points forward and says, the voices of so many Jews are necessary. We're waiting for them to join this conversation. The letter Aleph, if it points infinitely backward, it points infinitely forward as a reassurance, as an invitation, as a greeting, and most of all, the letter Aleph lays on all of our hearts always, saying to us, God is with us, not only when we can hear God's voice at Sinai, but when we can't hear God's voice, the letter Aleph lays there waiting for us to hear it better. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.